here today. And I think that we're going to have a very interesting day with many well-known speakers that will talk about informality and labor market regulation in Latin America. So let me say that informality is one of the most important aspects of regional labor market. So in all countries in Latin America, all of them have a very high degree of informality. And that's something that you don't see in developed countries in Europe or in North America. So that's a common feature, and that's something that's not only happening in the labor market. You can see informality in many aspects of our lives, but informality in labor market has consequences that are that could be dramatic consequence in terms of economic growth. An economy with very high degree of informality may invest little in their workers because the attachment that employers have with their employees is not formal or doesn't last as it should. So firms invest less than they could. Workers, they have high turnover. So that would explain lots of why you have a low productivity in our region. So today you're going to have the chance to talk about that in a more deep way. We have brought many academics that have devoted their lives or part of their academic lives to that matter. So we are very happy to have all of the invited speakers today. And let me say that I'm here replacing Marcos, the president of INSPER. Marcos had a personal affair to solve in Rio, so he had to fly to Rio this morning. But I'm saying that I hope that you enjoy your day here at INSPER and be welcome here. I would like also to thank to the team that has helped with organizing this. So that's a joint work with, and let me read, otherwise I'm gonna miss. So where it is, it's here. Yeah, so it's a joint collaboration between INSPER, Georgetown Americas Institute, Georgetown University Global Economic Challenges Network, Center for Microdata Methods and Practices, also known as CEMAP, and the Econometric Society. So we have Aureo, who's going to represent CEMAP, and Frank, who's going to represent Georgetown. But before I pass to them, let me just say that we'd like to thank a couple of people who has been very helpful and made this to happen. So Beto Caetano here, André Laos, Elaine, Mayara, Luciana, Rafael, Damarius, Ricardo, Ernesto, Carla, Flávia, Ciro, Vanessa, and Ellen, who has been great. So thank you guys for all the help. I might have forgotten someone, so I apologize for that. Yeah, so enjoy your day. Now I'm going to call Aureo that will show a movie for us, right? So thank you.
Bom dia. My name is Aureo de Paula. I'm a faculty member at University College London and also affiliated with the Institute for Fiscal Studies. In fact, actually, I'm wearing two hats today here. So my first hat is with CEMAP, the Center for Microdata Methods and Practice, which is a center under both UCL and the IFS in London, formed around broadly econometrics and applied econometrics. So on behalf of CEMAP, I would like to welcome you all, both here and online. My second hat is representing the Econometric Society and the Latin American Committee for the Econometric Society, of which I'm head. Sergio Firpo and Christine Pinto are also members of this committee. So the Econometric Society is also very proud of sponsoring this event, and we hope to do similar events in the future throughout the region. The Econometric Society was founded a little bit less than a century ago to foster the use of rigorous methodology in the analysis of economic behavior. This event fits the bill perfectly. So as Sergio was saying, we have superb speakers, phenomenal economists throughout the day on a theme of very, very important theme. Now, perhaps my third hat today is, as a DJ, I have to show you a little movie. So bear with me. It's actually very good. So let me see if I can do this right.
No political, no nationalistic bias.
It's exceptionally important for young African scholars.
It's a leading body of scientific work and sponsoring economics.
Being elected a fellow of the society is a great honor.
When I was a junior faculty, I would go to the summer meetings every year and got valuable feedback on the work that eventually led to the Nobel Prize.
The year is 1930, and invitations are sent to leading economists around the world to attend a meeting at the Statler Hotel in Cleveland on December 29th at 8 p.m. Its agenda, the creation of an international society for the advancement of economic theory in its relation to statistics and mathematics, which at the time was revolutionary, and to support unification between theory and factual studies in economics and a constructive and rigorous way of thinking, similar to that which has come to dominate in the natural sciences. In other words,
promoting the use of economic theory to study real-world data, thus making economics much more useful in the real world.
They call this new society the Econometric Society. 16 economists attended that first meeting. Irving Fisher, the father of econometrics, was its first president. In 1933, it launched its first journal, Econometrica, now regarded as one of the leading journals in economics, receiving well over 1,000 submissions a year. In 2006, it launched Theoretical Economics, and in 2010, Quantitative Economics, and a growing monograph series.
Econometrica is really a journal that's known for publishing important research in mathematical economics, economic theory, empirical work, econometrics, that has a long-lasting impact.
When I was in the World Bank, I saw firsthand how ideas that were published in Econometrica many years ago ended up being influential in actual policy.
Today, the Econometric Society has more than 7,000 members in 85 countries. Here's just some of what it gets up to and why it matters.
What separates the Econometric Society from other learned societies is that it's a truly global organization.
The Society organises up to 10 international meetings and 6 schools annually, and once every 5 years, a World Congress.
The Australasian meetings always attract an excellent group of international scholars.
In Latin America, the Econometric Society has been crucial for the development of a community of economists working on issues of interest to the region.
And as a woman from China, I really benefit a lot from Econometric Society. But I think not just me personally, I think for all the women Chinese economists.
It's the only society that brings together scientific research in economics and econometrics from across the world.
The Society has always supported the careers of economists.
I published my PhD thesis, my very first paper in Econometrica. That puts one on the map.
Over the last 4 years, we've had a winter school at the Delhi School of Economics, which has been in collaboration with the Econometric Society.
Summer schools provide a great opportunity for young scholars to learn the latest techniques and also to interact with other young scholars in their area and senior researchers in their area.
It's the intersection of economics, statistics, mathematics, and it gives credence, it gives support, it gives recognition to those of us who do mathematical economics, theoretical economics.
The Econometric Society started with 29 fellows in 1933 and has since elected over 1,110 fellows, representing more than 30 countries.
It is a huge honor to be elected by one's peers in the society.
In the society and in the professional general, I have always felt that I'm treated equally with everybody else, regardless of gender, of regional origin.
The Society receives financial support from its members, as well as from sponsors. It completes all of its work on a small budget and relies on the tremendous support of host institutions and hundreds of academic volunteers from around the globe. So how has the Econometric Society fared in its mission? At the latest count, the Nobel Prize in Economics has been awarded 53 times to 89 laureates between 1969 and 2020. Of the Society's 1,121 fellows, 81 have won the Nobel Prize in Economics, representing 91% of all winners. 28 of those Nobel winners have been president of the Econometric Society.
I still find reading the journal and looking at the forthcoming articles as a really important way of seeing what long-lasting innovations are really happening in economics and econometrics.
It establishes such a constant scientific dialogue among people who are geographically very distant. I think that's very impressive.
I just feel part of a family that has been in existence for a long time, and it just brings me a lot of joy, just knowing that the giants were there before me, and I'm trying to step in their footsteps.
To find out more, become a member, or to support the Econometric Society, get in touch at econometricsociety.org.
Okay. Isn't this great? So I guess you could see among the many speakers in the video, Penny, who is going to be one of the speakers today, who was our president last year. I'm also very proud to say that Eduardo Feingold has just been elected Fellow of the Econometric Society. And I hope the video, if you're not already engaged with the society, will prime you to go to our meetings and to become a member. We need to increase the percentage of members from 3.8% in Latin America to a little bit above that. With that, I'm going to call to the stage Frank Vella, who's going to say a few words on behalf of Georgetown. Thank you very much, and enjoy the day.
It's really a great pleasure to be here. And on behalf of Georgetown University, and more specifically the Georgetown Global Economics Challenge Network, I'd like to welcome everyone here, and also to thank INSPER for all its incredible hospitality. Just to give just a couple of words about what the network is about. It's an initiative from the university's president's office that to engage the leading academics with the highest quality policymakers in a discussion of very important issues. And today, I think, is like you could not get a better example of what the mission is than what we're doing today. On behalf of the Georgetown, I'd really like to express my gratitude to all the local organisers. I didn't write them down, but Sergio and Aureo and all their team here have done really an extraordinary job, really tremendous work in getting people. I want to thank all the speakers individually, but I do thank them all collectively. But I do want to particularly thank Penny and David Card, Penny Goldberg, who's going to speak in a moment, and we all saw in the video just a moment ago, for making really a fairly substantial sacrifice to be away from home, to come down and to speak to all of you. So thanks very much, Penny, and we'll thank David when he gets here. And I've also got to say Alejandro Werner, who's the director of the Georgetown Americas Institute, who unfortunately, his flight got cancelled, so he's not here. But he has really produced, along with the INSPIR people, an extraordinary panel that I'd like to, who are sitting, some of them are sitting there. So we'd like to thank you as well. I won't try to remember everybody's names because I'll forget somebody. So all I can say is, thanks to everybody, and I'm sure it's going to be a great day. So thank you.
So now I think we can start our first panel. But before that, let me say that we, INSPIR, would like to thank the financial support from Santander for making this happen. So I would like to invite now Christine Pinto, Penny Goldberg, Brenda Samaniego, and Gabriel Uliceia.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be the chair of this section about informality in Latin America and labor market. You have your keynote speaker, Penny Goldberg. She is a professor of economics and global affairs and affiliate of Economic Growth Center at Yale University. She was the former president of the Econometric Society and the chief economist of the World Bank. Then you're going to have our first invited section of Gabriel Uliceia. He's associated professor at the University College of London and the research fellow at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And then you're going to have our next invited section with Brenda Samaniego. Brenda is assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. So I think we can start because I think we are running out of time. So Penny, it's with you.
Hello, everyone. So let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. By the way, Frank, it was not a sacrifice to come here at all. I'm truly honored. It's been a great pleasure, and I would like, among others, to thank INSPIR for the hospitality. I'm going to talk about informality, trade, and development. And I'm particularly happy to be able to present here in a country where informality is actually very relevant and where there are also many people in the audience who have worked on this topic. So I'm sure I will get very, very valuable feedback. So it's very valuable for me to be here. It was not a sacrifice at all. Let me start with giving you some general motivation. Usually when I talk about this topic, I spend a very long time motivating it, and I don't think I need to do this here. In general, if you talk about these issues in the US or in Europe, you get a reaction, what is informality and who cares? I think it's fair to say that this is not the case in Latin America. Just to give you some numbers, some suggestive numbers. It's estimated that in Peru, and informality is as high as 80%. In Chile, it's about 35%. In a country like India, it's over 95%. Of course, these are extremely noisy measures, but it gives you some idea about the magnitude of the problem. That said, the informal sector, I think it's fair to say, it's near absent from academic work, both empirical and theoretical work. And there are good reasons for that. You may think on the empirical side, it's very natural that it's absent because by definition, informality has to do with firms or workers being unobservable to the government, and unobservable means that we imperfectly observe them in the data, in the official data sources we have. So perhaps it's not surprising that we don't see much empirical work on informality, but it's also absent from theoretical work. And to the extent I know one of the objectives of this conference is to bring academics and policymakers together. For policymakers, I think this is a very important issue, so it's a very natural topic where one should try to create a bridge between what is relevant to policy and what academics do. So let me also add that from a very personal point of view, in case you are wondering, my accent is Greek, so I'm Greek. So informality is also a very relevant issue in Greece. So I'm interested in informality also from that point of view. But last but not least, I'm a trade economist, and many of us have wondered over the years how trade interacts with informality. So for a long time, I've been doing work on Latin America with my longtime co-author, Nina Pauchnik, and we were analyzing trade liberalization episodes for several Latin American countries using the standard data sources. And one question that often came, especially from institutions like the World Bank, is how does the informal sector respond to all this? So you are leaving out a very large part of the economy. So part of my interest also arises from this interaction between trade and informality, and this is what this talk is going to focus on. More generally, whenever we talk in trade about the effects of trade beyond welfare or on distribution, we tend to do that without any regard to the particular institutional setting. So we apply the same models and the same tools to every country we use, while it's very clear that the effects do depend on institutions, and there is a new wave of papers, a new wave of work in trade that tries to explicitly recognize this point. So for example, there is a recent handbook chapter by Atkin and Donaldson that points out that in many countries, in many developing countries, there are distortions present. And in the presence of these distortions, the effects of trade can be very different. So you can think of informality as being such a distortion, or perhaps it's the outcome of several distortions that I'm going to talk about during this talk. So you can see this also as part of a more general agenda that tries to investigate how trade, how openness, how it affects countries in the presence of domestic distortions, what's the effect that trade has in the presence of these distortions, but also what's the effect that trade has on the distortions themselves. So a brief roadmap on what I'm going to talk about. Given that this is a keynote, I'll try to give you some background of the work that has been done in this area. And so I will start with some basic definitions. I think this is important in the case of informality because there are so many definitions around, and some stylized facts. Then I will talk very briefly about the consequences of informality and why this is something we care about. And then the main part of the talk is going to be on trade and informality. I will present a paper that we have been working on for many years with several co-authors, Rafael Di Carneiro, who unfortunately is not here, but I hope he can join us through Zoom, my colleague Costas Meir, and Gabriel, who's here. And finally, at the end, I will be a little speculative, and I will talk about something that I think is going to become increasingly important, namely the parallels between the gig economy and informality, and I will conclude with some questions regarding about the future, and perhaps about posing the question, perhaps we need to rethink how we approach the topic of informality. So with this somewhat lengthy introduction, let me get into the talk. There are many different definitions of informality, and these definitions tend to also depend on the country one focuses on. In general, you can define informality in terms of firms or in terms of workers. So in terms of firms, informal firms are those that don't register with authorities. So these are firms that are invisible to governments, firms that don't pay taxes. In terms of workers, usually we define informal workers as being workers that are not covered by labor regulations. So there is no formal labor contract. And that means they don't have access to benefits such as Social Security. Usually people include self-employed workers in the category of informal workers. This is partly because there seems to be better data on self-employment than informal employment. But again, this depends on the country. So now let me give you some basic facts regarding informality. I assume several of them are maybe known to you. But nevertheless, I'm going to use those to motivate what we are doing in the paper with Rafael and Gabriel and Costas. And let me start with the very first one that's very relevant to development. Informality and self-employment are negatively correlated with development. I think this will will not come as a surprise to anyone. This is a graph that relates self-employment to GDP per capita in 2013. Many of the graphs that you'll see are going to have self-employment, and this is because we have better data in many cases across countries for self-employment than other parts of informal employment. But they tell that they are very highly correlated. And what you see in this graph, it comes very clearly through, is that you have a very a strongly negative slope between self-employment, the percentage of the population that's self-employed, and GDP per capita. That said, within particular country groups, high income versus middle income versus low income, there is a lot of dispersion in the degree of informality. I don't know if you can see this graph from the back of the room, but what this graph does, it groups these countries according to the World Bank classification. So on the left, you have low-income countries. In the middle, you have middle-income countries. And on the right, the upper middle-income countries. And you can see that there is a slightly negative slope across these three groups. But within this group, there is a lot of variation in the degree of informality. So take, for example, the case of low-income countries, for example. So the degree of informality varies from 36% in Ethiopia, that's the bottom here. Oops. I'm sorry. Oops, one more. So this is 36% to Nepal, where it's 98%. Right? If you go to upper middle income countries, so over there, that's Bulgaria, that has only 19%. Paraguay has 71%. So within country groups, there is a lot of variation in the degree of informality. So that's fact one. Fact two, that's perhaps less well known, is that informality or self-employment have stayed stable over time, remarkably stable over time. And this is despite the fact that overall we've had fast growth across the world. We've had trade liberalizations in many countries. Many economies have become much more open over time. And despite all this, the degree of informality has stayed more or less stable across the economy. And informality remains very high in most emerging and developing economies. So perhaps the most striking case here is the case of India. India has grown very fast in the past 2 decades. We can argue about the exact growth number. There is a bit of controversy around that, but let's say the average growth was 7% or more per year. Over 95% of the firms are informal. Actually, I think the number is estimated to be around 98, 99%. 60 to 70% of labor force are presumed to be informal. So the reason you have a difference between firms and labor here is because the big firms are formal and they employ a lot of workers. But it's a case that there's a very recent paper, by the way, by Marianne Bertrand and Changtai Shem and Tsivanidis, and they show that in India, what happened is many firms grew by hiring contract workers, which would appear here, according to this definition, as informal workers. So there was growth, but this growth happened in the informal sector, not in the formal sector. So this is perhaps the most striking case, but more generally, it's true that across the world, we don't see a sharp decrease in informality despite growth. And this is another graph based on data from the ILO. This shows how informality has evolved from 1991, that's the first year, to 2018. And it shows the percentage of self-employed again across different regions of the world. The only region where you can see a negative slope is the region of here, East Asia and Pacific. So these are countries like China and Vietnam. But for the rest of the world, you see that the slope is essentially zero. In some countries, you have very low informality. These are the high-income countries down here, North America, Europe, but the countries that have had high informality in the past still have very high informality. So I emphasize that because this is something I'm going to come back to later in the talk. And finally, there has been a lot of work about how informality relates to firm size and ultimately productivity. There's recent work that has shown that firms in developing countries tend to be very small and informal. They never die, they never grow. And so the paper that has documented that very well is a paper by Shea and Klenow. You can see a set of graphs here that come from a different paper by Shea and Olken that was published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives in 2014. And what they did in that paper is they used data from 3 different countries: India, that's the top row in the graph, Indonesia, and Mexico. And for these 3 countries, they used data both for the formal and the informal sector. So the informal firms are also in these graphs. And what they did is they simply plotted the size distribution of firms as measured by the number of workers. And what you can see, if you look at the left column, is that there is a mass near 0. So this was to make the point that there was this view that in many developing countries, there is the middle that's missing. You have a lot of small firms, and you have a lot of large firms. And the point they made in this work is that you don't have a missing middle. You have everything missing but the very small informal firms. So there is high concentration at very small sizes. And what they do in the subsequent columns is they cut the data in different ways. Because there is this mass at 0, you cannot see much. So then they look consecutively at firms, let's say, between 10 and 200 workers, then 200, and 10 and 20, then 20 and 200, and so on. And in each case, you can see there is always a mass towards the left. So that was just showing 3 facts. There are many others regarding informality. Now, why do we care about that? What are the consequences of informality? I think we're going to talk about this extensively today. But let me mention 3 here that feature prominently in the literature, at least in the policy literature. In general, informal firms are considered to be anathema to development for 3 main reasons. One, they are very small. In order to be invisible, you have to stay small. And small size often breeds inefficiency. So that relates to an academic literature on size-dependent distortions. And this literature in academia is actually quite rich. A second reason, quite important, is that these firms don't pay taxes. And that hinders the provision of public goods. There is here in this context, there is a recent paper by Bachas, Fischer-Post, Jensen, and Zachman. It just came out. That looks at something very interesting. It looks at how capital and labor taxation have evolved over the last few decades in advanced economies and in developing countries. And they show that actually capital taxation has increased in developing countries. When they ask the question, why is this happening? So they look at actually at effective capital tax rates. So when they ask the question why this happened, their answer is it's because of trade liberalizations. Trade liberalization has shifted resources in these countries towards large firms, towards big corporate structures, and these corporate structures can be actually captured by the policymakers. They pay taxes. And so this is their explanation of why capital taxation has increased in many emerging economies. Relatedly, I can show you this graph that shows tax revenues by income groups. So the top line, that's the blue line, shows non-resource tax revenue in high-income countries as percent of GDP, and you can see that it's substantially higher than in low-income countries. Low-income countries is the yellow line, and the line in the middle, this refers to the middle-income countries. So, inadequate tax resources is a major constraint in many countries, especially low-income countries. And one reason that policymakers would value and transition to formality is to increase tax revenues. So that's the second reason. And the third one has to do with workers' welfare. So in general, informal jobs are considered to be bad jobs. They offer no security, no benefits. That said, informality may also offer more flexibility, and this flexibility may be particularly viable to economies that are hit with negative shocks, especially to economies that are very volatile. So the volatility may also provide a buffer. So in the following, I'm going to focus on two issues, on the issue of informality and efficiency, on what we know about this, and then secondly, on the evidence we have that informality can act as a buffer in some cases. So let me start with informality and inefficiency. So the question is, are all small informal firms less efficient than formal firms? So it seems most people assume yes, but it turns out the answer to this question is not uncontroversial. So to give you a very brief overview of the literature, there is a literature in academia that argues that small firms are not necessarily inefficient. And the first person who made this point was Jim Thibault in a paper at the Journal of Economic Literature in 2000. And Jim made the point that we see a lot of dispersion in firm productivity, and this is often viewed as a metric of inefficiency. But there are good reasons that you see this dispersion in developing countries that may have absolutely nothing to do with inefficiency. And very consistent with all the research that Jim Thibault has done, he's argued that the reason we see this small size is because these firms operate under very different conditions. It's all driven by the demand side of the market. So the demand side does not call for large firms. And in fact, these firms are optimal. They have the optimal firm size given the markets they serve. So there is a very similar point made in a much more recent paper by Foster and Rosenzweig that came out. It's a typo there. It's JP, not JEP. So that came out in March 2022. And they don't focus on firms, but they focus on farms. So I capitalized the A to make this clear. And there they show that the very small farms are actually efficient. The very large farms are also very efficient, and it's only the farms in the middle that are inefficient. And their explanation has to do with labor transaction costs. So they argue that when you are very small, you rely on family labor, you save on labor transaction costs. It's the middle that's inefficient. On the other side of the argument, you have, I would say, the majority of economists who would argue that small firms, and especially informal firms, so I use these terms interchangeably because most small firms in developing countries are informal. So there's a large literature in academia that argues that these small firms are inefficient. So there is, I'll mention briefly some of this work. There is the work by Laporta and Schleifer and Shane Klenow that documents much higher productivity dispersion in developing countries. You may know that using productivity dispersion as a measure of inefficiency is not without its problems, but it's one of the metrics that people use. And according to that metric, there is much more dispersion, productivity dispersion in developing countries. There is the work that I mentioned by Shane Klenow that documents that these firms are actually are inefficient by other metrics as well. And most importantly, when they're inefficient, they never really die. They stay on the market forever. There is a paper by Sharon Tolkien in the Journal of Economic Literature that looks at average products of capital and labor. So average product, ideally you would want a marginal product of capital and labor, not the average product. But they make a good case that under reasonable assumptions, the average product gives you a good idea of what the marginal product is in these industries as well. And they show that the average products of capital and labor are much lower in small firms. There is evidence from policy changes in India. So in India, they had reservations for small products. Certain products could only be produced by small firms. They lifted these reservations in 2006, and there is work by Harrison and Rothenberg that have analyzed the consequences of this policy change. They show that once they removed these reservations for small firms, there were many good outcomes, higher productivity, higher growth, higher employment, and so on. In trade, there is a very large literature on heterogeneous firms and also a literature on superstar firms that, again, documents that the firms that drive exports, that drive trade, are the big firms, not the small firms. So all this literature would suggest that it's actually the big firms that have higher productivity. In general, there are three views of informal firms. Gabriel, in his AER paper, has laid that out very nicely. There is the view that informal firms are small and inefficient, but they have to be informal because otherwise they wouldn't survive. So according to that view, the economies are characterized by a duality. There is one sector that's productive and then a second sector that consists of these small, inefficient firms that need to be informal in order to be in order to survive. So this is the view of survivors. Then there is the view that says that informal firms are actually parasites. They could break even. They are profitable enough to pay their taxes and still, survive, but they can do better by evading taxes. And so this is often referred to as the McKinsey view. And Santiago, sorry if I interpret your words here, but I think this is also the view that comes through in your book in 2008. And then there is also what I think Gabriel calls the romantic view, expressed by De Soto, namely that informal firms are held back entrepreneurs. They face very high cost, bureaucratic cost of registration, for example. And if they didn't face this cost, they would actually formalize. Which of these three views is actually accurate is important because it has very different implications. The literature, again, has very mixed views on them. So if you read Laporta and Schleifer, they endorse the dual view of firms and development more generally. Shen Dolken say that no view is entirely supported by the data. And Gabriel's paper in the AER also reaches the same conclusion. So Gabriel looks at Brazil specifically. And his conclusion is that ultimately all three types exist in the data, but firms respond to the conditions they face. And let me show you two graphs from his paper that actually show this point very clearly, I think. So the first one shows firm productivity and revenue distributions across formal and informal firms in Brazil. And even if you cannot see the specifics of the graph, you can see very clearly that there is overlap in these distributions. So there are some informal firms that are actually more productive than some other formal firms, and there are also, and vice versa, and that applies both to revenues, but also to firm productivity. Another graph, from the same paper that actually makes this point even more clearly is this graph that actually will take me a few minutes to explain. So this graph is generated by actually estimating a model of informality, and once you have the model, then you can actually do counterfactuals. So in this model, formal and informal firms face different costs of entry. So you can estimate the model at baseline, but then you can ask the question, so what would happen if we did what De Soto complained about, if we actually equalize the entry costs for formal and informal firms? Is it true then that we would see more entry of informal firms into the formal sector? And so what this graph shows, you see three lines. So the dotted line here shows the counterfactual. The solid lines show the baseline scenarios. And in the what the graph shows is on the horizontal axis, you have firms' productivity. There is a pre-entry productivity signal. On the vertical axis, you see the firm value net of entry cost. So firms will enter the formal sector when their net value, net of the entry cost, exceeds the net value they would have if they entered the informal sector. They will enter informally if the net value, net of the entry cost, is higher than the net value in the formal sector, and of course, in both cases, they have to be above 0. Okay, so, and these entry conditions then define thresholds of entry. So when you compute the counterfactual, then you can see that you can identify these 3 types of firms that I talked about. So what you see is you have some firms that used to be, before you equalize the entry cost, that used to be informal, and now they become formal. So these are the firms in this segment here. So these are the ones that correspond to De Soto's view, to the romantic view. You change the entry cost, and these firms become formal. So according to the estimates, these are about 9% of the total firms. Then you have this middle range here from here to here. So these are the firms that are the parasites. So these are firms that would make positive profits if they entered formally. That means if they pay their taxes. But still, they can make higher profits if they are informal. So these are exactly the firms that stay informal to avoid taxes. And these firms are estimated to be around 42%, so it's a very large percentage. And then you have this mass of firms here, around 49%. So these are the survivors. So these are the firms that need to be informal because otherwise their net value would be below 0. So if you look at this graph, and again, the caveats are, this applies to Brazil. We don't know if you can extrapolate to other countries, but at least for this graph, you could conclude that this view that that informal firms are held back entrepreneurs is not supported by the data. On the other hand, there is a large mass of survivors. That's important because if you try to eliminate those, you might create a huge social problem. But there is a big fraction of firms that are parasites, and for these firms, one policy approach might be you crack down on informality. So that refers to inefficiency. What about informality as a buffer? So what do we know about this? The answer there, I think, is less controversial, and the answer, interestingly, comes from the trade literature. So there has been a wave of papers recently that has exploited trade shocks to ask the question, how does the informal sector in Latin America mainly respond to changes in trade? And so the papers I'm going to talk about next are all papers that have analyzed the Brazilian trade liberalization of the early 1990s. And they exploit regional variation in the trade exposure. So because of that, because they exploit this regional variation, so essentially these are all definitive studies, I think despite the fact that they exploit trade shocks, it's inappropriate to think of those shocks as being really trade shocks. I think it's more appropriate to think of those as being demand shocks. And again, I'll come back to this point later in the talk. But this is not a case where these different regions or different sectors are linked to each other by trend of balance constraints or exchange rates. So in this literature, you view each region in Brazil, each district, as a different economy. So because of that, I think it's best to think of the shocks that I'm going to show you in a moment, the tariff shocks, as negative demand shocks. So here is a graph that comes from a paper by the other co-author of this work, Rafael de Carneiro. So Rafael has a few papers on the trade liberalization of Brazil, and especially its impact on the informal sector. And the first thing to see here in this graph is what happens to the formal sector employment and earnings when Brazil is hit with these negative demand shocks at the regional level. So first, let me point out, so most of you, I assume, know that, but I think it's worth emphasizing that again. One nice feature of the Brazilian trade liberalization is that it all played out between 92 and 94. So it's really a shock. as opposed to a long-run development like the China shock. So therefore, you can say the shock took place during this period, and then you can analyze its long-run effects. And what this graph shows is that there were actually adverse long-run effects on local labor markets. You see employment, this is formal employment, going down over time, and you see also formal earnings going down over time. And what's interesting about this graph is it shows these effects are not short-lived. It's not that the economy bounces back after a few years. These are long-lived effects. Okay? But this is all the formal sector. Then, in actually a separate paper, what Rafael and Brian did is they looked specifically at how the informal sector responded to these same demand shocks. And again, I'm not sure if you can see the numbers from the back of the room, but let me tell you what the story they tell. So what they find is that in the short to medium run, so that's 91 to 2000, you see an increase in the non-employed. You also see an increase in informal employment. So this happens in the aftermath of the trade liberalization. But then if you look at what happens in the long run, so if you extend the time span to the year 2010, then what happens is the negative effects on employment disappear. So employment bounces back to its previous level, but informality increases substantially. So you look at these results, and they provide a very strong suggestive evidence that the informal sector in this case acted as an employment buffer. Without the informal sector, unemployment might have been much larger. And this point is also reinforced in another paper by two Brazilians, Pocznek and Ulicea, that came out in the Economic Journal 2022. And there they use the same type of shock. So again, they look at regional variation, but they interact the regional variation with enforcement, with how strict enforcement was across regions. And there is a clever instrumental variable strategy in the paper to address possible endogeneity concerns. But then they find that in areas, in regions in Brazil where enforcement was stricter, you had lower increases in informality, but larger increases in unemployment. So this is additional evidence that informality here acted as an employment buffer during this period. So to sum up, if you look at this work across the board, I would summarize the evidence as follows. There is a lot of evidence that most informal firms are less efficient than formal firms, so they are survivors. And that means driving them out of the market through enforcement would promote growth, but it would also create a big social problem. There are also many firms that are parasites, and you might want to drive those out, both for efficiency and for tax reasons. There is a lot of evidence that informality does serve as an employment buffer, but all this evidence is based on diff in diff. But at the end, you're left with the question, how do we trade off all these considerations? A lot of this work is based on diff in diff. So diff in diff is a very credible empirical strategy, but it only gives us relative effects. So in the end, one needs some more general framework to put all these pieces together. And this is what led to the paper, to the main paper I'm going to talk about, which is, we call it the DGMU paper, that I'm going to come in a few moments. Before I do that, let me also say a few words about the role of trade, the role that trade plays in the informal sector, and talk briefly about the existing work on this topic. So in general, when it comes to trade, there are two views in the literature and that are held very strongly. So first, there is a very strong prior that trade contributes to growth and structural transformation. And as the economies grow, the share of the informal sector declines. So according to this view, all you need to do is promote growth through openness, and then informality will take care of itself. And the problem with this view is that it's at odds with the macroeconomic evidence that I just showed you. So if you remember the graphs that I showed you at the beginning of this talk that show that these trends are across the world, they are flat. We don't see a sharp increase in informality, despite the fact that we had very fast growth. These graphs call this view into question. On the other hand, there is some evidence that there may be truth to this view, and this evidence comes from another line of work by McCaig and Pouchnik, who focused not on Latin America this time, but on Vietnam, and they exploited the massive trade liberalization of Vietnam when it opened up its relations with the United States. And what they showed is exactly the story that the proponents of this view have. Vietnam opens up, and you have structural transformation, and you have workers moving from the informal sector to formal manufacturing, and associated with that are big productivity gains. So this is exactly the story that you read, when people make this point that all you need is openness. But this work is again based on diff in Vietnam, so it's not based on a general equilibrium framework. So again, it documents relative effects, not absolute effects. That's one view. Then there is the second view, that's exactly the opposite view, and this is that trade increases informality, and this is because domestic firms, when you open up, domestic firms face more import competition. They need to cut costs to stay competitive, and therefore they tend to hire more informal workers, contract workers, and so on. And there is a lot of work along this line, so I've done some work again with Nina Pouchnik on that from Colombia and Brazil, and diff in diff again based on sectoral variation, and the results were mixed. The papers I just mentioned by Rafael Di Carneiro and Kovac and Gabriel, and Pouchnik and Licea, all these papers, again, are based on diff in diff, and all these effects show that when you document relative effects, those sectors or those regions that are hit with a more negative shock, they tend to increase informality. So these studies are very much consistent with this second view, but again, they all document relative effects. So I would say there is no, so I was talking before with Brenda, who, she told me she's not going to present this paper today, but she's doing work now on Mexico, on how Mexico was affected by the US-China trade war. And I think there the result is that, again, it increased informality, that the increase in exports in Mexico increased informality in these countries. So I think the evidence is very mixed on these topics. So what we decided to do with Rafael and Costa and Gabriel is try to build a general equilibrium framework to put all these considerations into one framework and try to structure our thinking around these issues. So this is for the remainder of the talk, this is the paper I'm going to talk about. So let me give you a brief overview of what this paper is, of how this paper works. How much time do I have? How much? 30. Okay, good. So this is a structural equilibrium model of a small open economy. We're going to focus on Brazil, and the assumption of a small open economy, I think, is reasonable in this context. So the model has the following basic ingredients. There are heterogeneous firms that have a choice between operating in the informal sector. If they operate in the informal sector, then they can be caught, in which case they face a penalty. And even if they don't pay the penalty, they face other disadvantages. They cannot participate in formal finance. They cannot participate in the export sector. So there is a cost to being informal. On the other hand, they can choose to be formal, and then they don't face these disadvantages, but then they are subject to labor regulations and they pay taxes. So that's the product side, that's the firm side. On the labor market, there are search and matching frictions, and these frictions give rise to unemployment and also to wage dispersion. We have a rich institutional setting in the paper, so we have minimum wages in the model, hiring and firing costs, which I understand are important in Brazil, payroll and revenue taxes, and importantly, we also have government enforcement. Regulations are imperfectly enforced in the model, and that's what ultimately gives rise to informality. In the model, trade is going to play an important role, and just to give you the overview, trade is going to enter in two ways. We have some firms that are going to export, so we have exporters. Only formal firms can export. but we also have imports of intermediates, and the intermediates is a second channel through which trade can affect the economy. Importantly, the model is dynamic, and that makes it quite complicated, but for reasons I'm going to explain in a moment, we thought this was important. The main reasons you want to have a dynamic model in this context is because we have firing costs. These are one important driver of informality, and firing costs call for a dynamic framework. And then one of the main facts we document is that the transition rates from unemployment to the informal sector are approximately twice as large as the transition rates from unemployment to the formal sector. So this plays an important role in the data and also in our model. And again, you need a dynamic model to explain that. Finally, in this paper, we focus on the steady state, not on transitional dynamics. And let me say that I think the transitional dynamics are most important, and ideally you want to move towards addressing those, but the steady state is the first step. We develop this framework, and then we estimate the model using several data sources. Importantly for Brazil, as many of you know, we have relatively good information on the informal sector, and this is one of the reasons that Brazil is one of the very few countries where there has been work on informality. So let me briefly mention these data sets. So there are 5 data sets that capture the formal sector only. So one of them is RAIZ, that captures all formal and informal firms. So these data are being increasingly used in research, and I'm sure many people already know them. In addition, we use the SESEX, the customs data that allow us to identify which firms are exporters. So by combining RAIZ and SESEX, we have a lot of information on firms in the formal sector only. Now, RAIZ doesn't give us any information on revenues or inputs for these firms. We have a lot of information on workers. So we also use 3 firms, again, for the formal sector that give us information on revenues and inputs. And these are the PIA, PAS, and PAC. So they capture the industrial sector, the service sector, and the retail sector, respectively. So between these 5 data sets, we have a pretty good picture of the formal sector. Then for the informal sector, we use 2 data sets. One is the SINF, which is a survey capturing the informal, capturing all small firms, but that includes informal firms. So I think of this as being very similar to RAIZ, except it's available only for 1 year, for 2003. So one of the reasons we focus only on steady states and only on 1 year is because we have data for informal firms only for this 1 year, 2003. And also it's a survey that is available only for urban firms. And finally, we use the PME, which is a household survey. And again, this captures both formal and informal workers. And that allows us to get information about transition from unemployment to the formal sector, or formal to informal, and so on. So these 2 surveys, SINF and PME, allow us to capture the informal sector in Brazil. And one question that I very frequently get is, all this information is self-reported. How reliable is it? Firms clearly may have an incentive to misrepresent whether they're formal or informal. And my understanding is that actually the data for Brazil are reliable, partly because there are guarantees given to the firms that confidentiality will be respected, that this data is not going to be used for auditing purposes or to penalize those firms that evade regulations. Let me also point out that based on this data, we estimate the degree of informality, the percentage of informality, to be around 50% in Brazil, so it's very high. So if you think there is misreporting, then it could be even higher, which makes this problem even more important. We estimate the model using this data set, and then we use this estimated model to perform counterfactual simulations. And so we ask the question, what happens as we liberalize? What would happen if we had stricter enforcement of informality, and so on? So this is, in a few words, what the framework looks like. And now, let me give you some more details. So when developing the model, one is faced with a myriad of choices, modeling choices. So before I get into the model, let me give you some basic facts that we try to capture in the model. So these are the facts that motivated the model development. So at the minimum, we make sure that the model can replicate these facts. And again, some of them will not come as a surprise to you, and they have been documented elsewhere, but nevertheless, I think there are facts that are really important for a theoretical framework to capture. So the first one is that Brazil has a large informal sector. So in our data, it's about 48% of employment. And second, I already mentioned that. This is going to be important in our framework. Transitions from unemployment to informality are twice as large as transitions from unemployment to formal. So this is a table that shows you these facts. So here is the share of informal employment, around 48%. And these are the transition rates. So you can see that the transition rate from unemployment to informality is twice as large as from unemployment to formality, meaning simply that if you are unemployed, you are much more likely to be absorbed by the informal sector. Another thing that I found quite interesting, and again, you may know that, but it's not obvious to most people. So you see a lot, the service sector is of course very large in Brazil, both the informal service sector and the formal service sector. And informality is particularly prevalent in the service sector, so around 50% of the workers in the informal, well, in the service sector are informal, but you also see a lot of informality in manufacturing, in the tradable sector. Fact two is that the probability that a firm is informal declines sharply with a firm size, with employment size. I think that's not surprising. Fact three, informal firms are on average less productive than formal firms. And again, I emphasize on average because we have this overlap in productivity distributions, and that's something we can replicate. The average informal worker is paid lower wages than the average formal worker. We can talk about this later. I think this, again, is well documented. And finally, let me emphasize fact five, because again, this will play an important role in our model. Firm-level labor turnover is lower as firms are large. So large firms have lower turnover, but conditional on firm size, exporters have much higher turnover. So these, you can see that here. So again, large firms are more stable, you have less volatility, but conditional on size, exporters are much more volatile. So again, that's going to be important for us. So the model we develop will try to replicate at least these five facts. Okay, so I don't have much time, so let me go through the model really fast. So the slides will be posted, and you have the paper, and you can read the math in, at your leisure. But let me point out some important features of the framework. So on the consumer side, we assume homogeneous, infinitely lived workers consumers. They obtain utility by consuming two composite goods, a tradable is denoted by C here, and a non-tradable S. S is services. Okay? Each of them is a CS aggregate of many varieties, and this is the second and third line here. So just one quick remark. This is a model that is going to have many assumptions. The CS assumption is a strong one, and it's one that's very common in trade because it makes modeling tractable. It's not one that's innocuous here, okay? It has important implications, and the reason for that is because built in the model is a love for variety. So consumers value variety, and this means here in our framework, whether you are formal or informal, every firm adds to consumers' utility. So this is going to bias in general for valuing informality, right? Because every informal firm, by producing the product they do, by having one cart on the street, you add to consumers' utility. Personally, and I'm not going to talk here on behalf of my co-authors, this is something I like because I think if it were up to economists, many economists would be advocates of having one giant cafeteria in the world for efficiency purposes, one giant supermarket, one huge high-rise, and this is not how humans are. Humans value variety. So perhaps, we are going to the other extreme here of allowing for too much variety, and this may bias towards, in favor of informality. But I think when we think about informality, it's important to actually allow for this in the model. So I will actually, I'm willing to defend this. That's all I want to say. So on the firm side, we have heterogeneous firms, as I said. Each of them, there is a roundabout production structure. So each firm produces goods using labor and using an intermediate input. The intermediate input here is I. And the intermediate inputs themselves are aggregates, are composites of tradable and a non-tradable. Each of them, again, is a CS aggregate of many varieties, tradable and non-tradable varieties. The intermediate inputs, as I said before, are quite important in our model because some of them are important, and it's one way through which trade is going to affect the economy. Firms' productivity follows an AR1 process that you see down here. Regarding the timing, let me show you this graph. So let's start with time t0. You can consider the problem that an informal firm faces. First, if you're an informal firm, you have three choices. You can stay informal, you can exit the market, or you can become formal. Let's say you stay informal, then you choose how much labor to employ. This is L prime in the next period. Then you realize your profits. In the paper, you'll see everything is indexed by K and I. K is going to be the sector, so that means tradable or non-tradable, and I is the firm type. Here it's informal. And then, at the end of the period, it draws a new productivity, draws Z prime, and then this game starts again. Let me also emphasize that the value function has here two arguments always, productivity and employment size. In many cases, when I convey intuition, I actually do it in terms of productivity, just to give intuition, but actually both enter the value function. A formal firm faces a similar problem. It can stay formal, or it can exit. We don't allow the formal firms to become informal directly, partly because it would be very cumbersome computationally, and partly because it would be unnatural for a formal firm to, which is visible to the government, next period to become invisible. But a formal firm can exit the market and then stay out one period, and then the next period enter informality again. So that channel is possible. So a formal firm faces the same problem. It draws a productivity in period T, in period 0, and depending on the productivity draw, it can stay formal or it can exit. Conditional on staying formal, it chooses labor in the next period, and then it realizes profits, then it draws again a productivity draw, and so on. On entry, firms, again, have to pay an entry cost to enter the market, and then they draw their productivity. Depending on the productivity signal they get, they can choose to enter the informal sector with size 1. They can stay exit, so that's immediate exit, or they can enter the formal sector. Regarding the profit functions, so let me show you the profit functions because that's where all the institutional details come through. So let's look at the formal firm first. So in the formal firms, what you see in red are parts of the profit function that are different between formal and informal firms. So a formal firm has revenues, that's actually value added, but they pay taxes, they pay revenue taxes or value added taxes. This is the tau Y here. And they have variable costs, C, and this is the fixed cost of operation. Now, if you think about what the variable costs are, what are the variable costs? In our model, we just have labor as an input. So the variable costs consist of the wage costs. Now, formal firms face minimum wage regulation. So the wage they pay is the maximum between a wage that's going to be determined through the market mechanism and the minimum wage. And they also pay payroll taxes. So you see that when it comes to the wage bill, there are two things that are specific to formal firms. They face minimum wages and they pay payroll taxes. If they decide to grow their labor force, they pay hiring costs. This is this H term here. And then on the other hand, if they decide to shrink the labor force, that's the second line here, then they pay this wage bill, but they also face firing costs, which my understanding is they're very high in Brazil. So this is the profit function for a formal firm. For an informal firm, on the other hand, the profit function looks a bit different. So again, you have value added, but here there are no taxes. They don't pay taxes. There are variable costs that are going to look a little different, as I will explain in a moment. And there is a cost to informality. This is this red term here. What are the costs to informality? So these are size-dependent costs to informality. You can think of these as being this cost, this opportunity cost I mentioned before, namely, if you're an informal firm, you cannot be an exporter, you don't have access to formal finance, so these are opportunity costs, but there could be also a real cost. If you get caught, then there are penalties, so in the worst case, they can shut you down. So all these would enter here. So this is a disadvantage of being informal. On the other hand, when it comes to costs, these are the wage costs. There is no minimum wage regulation that they have to comply with, and there are no payroll taxes. Just like the formal firms, if they decide to expand, they have to pay hiring costs. On the other hand, if they fire workers, if they shrink, there are no firing costs. So these institutional differences between formal and informal firms are captured through the profit functions. So I'll skip the rest. So we do the usual CS math, and from that you can get revenues and value added. And then on the labor side, again, I'll be fast here. We have random matching, so workers are matched to firms and vacancies according to a random matching model. Once workers are matched, then there is Nash bargaining between firms and workers, and Nash bargaining determines the wages. There are search frictions in the model, and the search frictions explain the fact that you can have informal or unproductive firms that can keep workers, but they have to pay these workers lower wages. In the open economy, we have two additional considerations. So some of these intermediate inputs are imported, as I mentioned, but we also have exporters. And regarding exporters, the export decision is modeled as in the Mellitz model, so firms have to pay a fixed cost. If their value function net of this fixed cost of entry is positive, then they enter the export market. Otherwise, they stay out. Okay, so that's the structure of the model. One more thing I want to point out that is going to be important in our framework. If you actually write down the value added of domestic producers and exporters, they end up looking like this. And I'm sure this doesn't mean much to you, but you can see there is this term here that's specific to exporters, and you can show that this term is greater than 1. The reason this is important is because this is the term that creates this magnification of volatility for exporters. So if an exporting firm is hit with a productivity shock, then the effect on the revenues is much larger than it is for a domestic exporter. And this is important in our framework. If you remember, fact 5 was a fact that documented that exporters, conditional on size, tend to be more volatile than domestic firms. And in the model, it's this aspect, it's this magnification term that generates this fact. So I will skip, the rest of the model, but let me speak briefly to the mechanisms that drive informality in this model. So there are several mechanisms, and they push informality in many different directions. So, generally in terms of methodology, this is not a theory paper. In a theory paper, you would try to write a clean model that gives you one effect, that gives you an intuition. And in reality, the world is very complicated, and it's actually even too complicated to be completely captured by our model. But we try to make the model general enough so that the answer how trade affects informality is not unambiguous and theoretical reason. So it's ultimately an empirical one. So you have all these mechanisms pushing informality in different directions. So what are these mechanisms? On one hand, you have what we call Mellitz type effect. So you have thresholds for entry or informality changing as a result of trade. So what happens is, let's say you liberalize the economy. Liberalize means you may reduce the iceberg trade cost or the tariffs. That is going to enter the model as a negative demand shock, and that has the following consequences. On one hand, there is a negative demand shock. So that means that less productive formal firms will exit. Okay, that is going to push up informality. But on the other hand, the least productive informal firms may exit. So that will tend to actually reduce informality. And if you think about this debate I talked about before in the trade literature, so does trade increase or decrease informality? This is very much reflected into these two effects, right? So on one hand, you have additional competition. Additional competition means I want to be more competitive, I need to cut my costs, I become informal. So this is, this first effect in the model, but you also have the other effect that trade is pushing the inefficient firms out of the market. So this is going to actually decrease informality. Then you have additional effects that come through the cheaper intermediates. Cheaper intermediates increase worker productivity. And again, this may, as worker productivity increases, incomes also increase. And that means some productive informal firms may decide to become formal. That will depress informality, but you can also generate the opposite effect. So all these thresholds can go either way. Then we have a second type of mechanism that's dynamic in nature, and that has a lot to do with unemployment. So what happens is as you open up to trade, you shift resources towards large firms. Okay, we know that large firms are more stable. So that means that these firms are going to have less unemployment. Okay? Now, less unemployment means actually fewer transitions to informality. Remember that once you become unemployed, you are much more likely to end up in the informal sector than in the formal sector. So any mechanism that generates more unemployment is also going to generate more informality in this model. So with trade, you shift resources towards large firms, so that will tend to decrease unemployment and also decrease informality. But on the other hand, these large firms are exporters. Exporters are more volatile, and more volatility means more unemployment. And again, more unemployment means more informality. So these things can go in either direction depending on whether the size effect is going to dominate or the sensitivity effect of exporters is going to dominate. Okay, so these effects are not theoretically unambiguous. Ultimately, you need to do the empirics to figure out the answer. So we estimate the model, and then we do various counterfactual simulations. So let me very briefly go through the simulations and what we find in the end. So I'll do that using a series of graphs. So first, what happens if you reduce the trade costs? So in these graphs, think of our baseline value is 2.5. We start here. And then if you go to 6, this is a case that corresponds to autarky, roughly. If you go to 1.5, this is a case where you would have a 40% reduction of trade costs. So this would approximately correspond to what happened in East Asia, right? A massive trade liberalization. And so the first result of the paper that actually proved to be very robust to everything we tried is that in the tradable sector, so only in C, when you liberalize, when you open up to trade, informality decreases sharply and unambiguously. And as you move towards autarky, informality increases. So what's the mechanism? Very simply put, this efficiency-generating mechanism dominates. It's true that you also get, this competition effect, this tendency to increase informality to stay competitive, but the effect, this efficiency effect, dominates. So this is something that very much replicates what Pouchnik and what McKeck and Pouchnik found for Vietnam, and very much supported this view that structural transformation growth lead to a decrease in informality, but only in the tradable sector. If you look at what happens in the non-tradable sector, it's exactly the opposite. Actually, in the non-tradable sector, it goes in the opposite direction. And the intuition there is that, as you'll see in a moment, this trade openness generates additional income. So that's a positive demand shock for the economy. There is additional demand for services, and that generates incentives to enter And among other things, there are also very small informal firms that enter the service sector. So then if you put the two together, so what happens in the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector, what you end up with for the economy as a whole, when you aggregate across the two sectors, is a pattern that's not clear. It depends. The effect of trade on informality depends on where you start. If you start here and you go here, you would say informality actually increased. If you started here and you went here, you would say it decreased. If you started with a benchmark and you considered a massive trade liberalization, there would hardly be a change. So the effect there is much less clear. And so that may explain why ultimately in the data, when you look at the economies as a whole, you don't see a clear effect over time of trade liberalization or openness or growth on these economies. You find that the informality remained steady. In our model, this is generated by the fact that the non-tradables react in a very different way from the tradable sector. What happens to unemployment as you open up to trade? Unemployment increases quite sharply. And the reason here is that this volatility effect that exporters have dominates. Okay? So it's true that as you shift resources to the large firms, you create a stability effect. And one way we see it, I don't have the time to present the detailed results, but actually if you look at what happens in the non-tradable sector in our model, in the non-tradable sector, volatility goes down as you open up. And the reason is large firms become more important. But in the tradable sector, the volatility of exporters dominates, and as a result, you have an increase in the unemployment rate. Despite this, real incomes increase. So in our model, we have two welfare measures. We have real incomes, raw real income, but we also have real income net of the disutility of unemployment, which I think is a better measure because you do want to take into account that people don't want to be unemployed. And so despite the fact that you have a rise in unemployment, our welfare measures both actually go up. So trade does generate this increase in welfare. What happens to TFP? Productivity increases sharply. And one thing that's interesting is that if you take the informal sector into account, actually productivity increases by much more than if you abstract it from the informal sector. Why? The reason here I think is quite obvious. Studies that focus on the formal sector alone, they document the productivity increase in the formal sector, which is significant, and we can also show it here. That's the blue line in the graphs. But at the same time, what they don't capture is that you have the exit of the small, inefficient, informal firms, thanks to trade. So trade liberalization creates this cleansing effect. It eliminates the inefficient firms, and you get a sharp increase in total aggregate productivity. In the service sector, you get the opposite, but overall in the economy as a whole, you do get a very large increase in TFP. What about inequality? One of the interesting results in the paper is that if you take the standard result in the trade literature is that if you focus on one particular dimension of inequality, namely inequality across firms, okay, then trade tends to increase inequality. And the reason is it shifts resources towards exporters, towards large firms, towards exporters. These are firms that pay higher wages. And we replicate it here. If you look at the standard deviation of log wages, it's true that in the formal sector, trade increases inequality. But if you take the informal sector into account, then in the end, what you find is actually that trade decreases inequality, and this is because it compresses the dispersion in the informal sector, as well as the distance between formal and informal wages. So as a result, you end up with less inequality in that particular dimension of inequality, namely inequality across firms. You end up with less inequality than without the informal sector. Overall, what's a few more minutes? Yeah. Thank you. So you get with a very positive view of trade, namely trade has these very positive effects on productivity without, it doesn't affect aggregate informality, but it does affect total productivity, and at the same time it increases a very sharp increase in real incomes. What happens if you have a negative productivity shock? So we wanted to look at this scenario specifically because it generates this, you may be able to address this buffer effect that I spoke about before. So what we do is we hit this economy with a negative productivity shock, and then we do that under 3 scenarios. One scenario is one where we use the benchmark values for informality. This is another one where you suppress informality completely. And the third one is one where you have stricter enforcement of informality. And what happens in this case is, I'm out of time, so I'll summarize the results for you in qualitative terms. What you find is that, in fact, informality here acts as an unemployment buffer. So without informality, you get a much bigger increases in informality, in unemployment. This is perhaps not surprising. However, what's also interesting is that what we find is informality is not a welfare buffer. And namely, what happens is you don't create much unemployment, but real incomes decrease, and they decrease more than they would decrease in the case where you had no informality at all. This may seem counterintuitive, but actually what drives that is that if you have no informality, you have such a strong productivity gain. So you have a negative shock in this economy, and then without informality, what happens is all small, inefficient firms get completely eliminated from the market. They get completely driven out. That generates a huge aggregate productivity increase, and ultimately, real incomes increase. So as a result, the effects on real income tend to be much better without informality in that case than they are with informality. So the conclusion from that is that that informality is an employment buffer, but it's not a welfare buffer. So let me conclude with what basically we learned from this exercise. We do find that openness reduces informality in the tradable sector. It does not reduce informality in the economy as an aggregate. We find that actually trade generates significant TFP gains. And it does that while increasing real incomes at the same time and decreasing inequality. So this was not the objective of our work, but in the end, this ends up being an ode to free trade. So trade has all these positive effects. On the other hand, if you consider a scenario where you try to enforce regulations and eliminate informality, you generate huge productivity gains in the model, but you generate unemployment and actually welfare declines. So if you approach this question from a productivity point of view, you would come to the conclusion that trade is a much better way to achieve that than suppressing informality. Finally, some concluding thoughts, and I promise I will stop here in terms of the future. So as I said before, this is very speculative. Enforcement has proven very difficult for informality. So despite the fact that in the end, we find that if you are interested in productivity, you may want to open up the economy and not suppress informality, but you may still want to suppress informality if you want to raise taxes. So from that point of view, from the point of view of collecting taxes, it's still important to policymakers to suppress informality. But enforcement has proven extremely difficult. Now we have new technologies, so digitalization in principle, it makes everything visible. In my own home country, the informal sector has been declining over time, and the reason is everything has become, all transactions are now digital. So it makes it much easier to capture transactions, but at the same time, technology has changed the nature of firms and the nature of work. So now there are many parallels between the gig economy and informality. So all that a worker needs in order to connect to a firm is an internet connection, and then it can connect to firms. You don't need a formal employment contract to do that. You are not a formal employee if you work for Uber or TaskRabbit. So as a result, labor markets have become more fluid. We have more self-employment. There are no long-term contracts, no benefits. But at the same time, there is much more flexibility in work schedule. And the main difference is, of course, that many of these firms in the gig economy, at least in the US, they do pay their taxes. So you have, this new economy where firms do pay taxes. So this incentive for making firms formal is no longer there. But the challenges that workers face are, in many ways, they're very similar to the challenges that informal workers have faced in developing economies. And one implication of that, and we may want to talk about this later during the day, is that if you're going to go with such an economy, you need to shift the social protection system from the employer to the state, because the employer no longer provides that. Which ultimately leads me to the question of whether we need to rethink informality, because the traditional thinking has always been for policymakers to try to curb informality, mainly for efficiency reasons, but also for tax collection reasons. But at the same time, political economy has dictated support for small firms, and including informal firms. Economists always emphasize the role of large firms, especially for development. But if you're interested in efficiency and productivity, you can achieve the same by being more open to the world. You don't necessarily have to suppress informality. If you're interested in tax collection, perhaps you can achieve the same through digitalization. And finally, the new economy, the gig economy, may allow one to combine to a certain extent the advantages of informality, which are you have much more flexibility. It can act as a buffer to unemployment, but also you have more flexibility, which these days are valued by many workers, while at the same time with digitalization, you can avoid the worst aspect of informality, which is tax evasion. And finally, let me conclude by saying that in some sense, many developing countries, many low or middle income countries may have an advantage in this economy because there are many parallels between the gig economy and the informal sector, and these developing economies have lived with the informal sector for a very long time. So workers have learned how to cope in this reality, which is not necessarily true for workers in advanced economies. So I'll stop here and thank you very much for your patience. And I'm sorry that I went late.
Good morning, everybody. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. This is a great pleasure to be at home talking about such important issues that have been part of my research agenda, but that's been part of our lives for the longest time. So it's really, really great. And being great company as well in terms of speakers. I'll switch gears in terms of, compared to Penny's presentation, in the sense that I'll zoom in into a specific paper, and which is Firm Dynamics and the Labor Market Effects of Rural to Urban Migration, which is joint work with Clément and Beth at Warwick. And although it seems a bit almost orthogonal to what Penny was just discussing, you can think about both, in particular the second part of her talk, as kind of how economies respond to different shocks and big shocks in the presence of informality or costly regulation that is imperfectly enforced, and therefore you have informality. In that case, she was emphasizing trade costs. Here, actually, we'll think about labor supply shocks to urban economies induced by rural to urban migration, so internal migration. And then just to start motivating, it's true and it remains true that urban population continues to grow quite fast in developing countries. That's true even in Latin America, where like most countries, if not all countries, have already undergone the demographic transition and urbanization process. It's still the case that urban populations grow fast. Of course, it's not the case here in São Paulo, in Rio, but actually in more medium-sized urban centers. These are just a couple of numbers that I find quite impressive in the last 5 years. Actually, yeah, 2000 to 2015, that growth was around 12.5% in the period. Whereas there's a projected growth of 64% in the next years. Okay, so that's still remains quite sizable. And perhaps the big underlying question or overarching question in this paper, but and a lot of what we will discuss, I guess, today is how these developing economies will be able to cope with this increasing labor supply, increasing population in urban centers, and produce not only jobs, but good jobs to absorb this ever-growing workforce. And then, of course, behind that as well, and that's how we'll talk a lot about informality throughout this paper, is oftentimes good jobs are associated to formal jobs. And for good reasons, but everything constant, everything else equal, a formal job will provide you typically more job stability, compliance with minimum wage regulations, but also other forms of job safety regulations, unemployment insurance, social security, so on and so forth. Now, and then again, connecting to what we talk in this paper, there are good reasons for why we should be at least, why this urban population growth could be a major challenge. The first one is actually, Penny has shown us facts about this, is that developing countries and Latin America is also included in this group, is typically characterized by low firm growth, high shares of informality, underemployment, and oftentimes unemployment together. So that already, it's kind of like red flag number one. Now, a second thing that characterizes, still the case that characterizes this urban labor workforce growth is that rural to urban migration continues to represent an important part of this process. It's not the majority of it in many countries, but it's still a substantial part of it. Even, and to my surprise, even when you look at Brazilian data, okay? And then, at least that was the view that framed a lot of my thinking coming to this project, and I think it's probably, it's fair to say it's the dominant view about rural to urban migration in most developing settings, is the Harris-Dodaro view, which will predict that these inflows of individuals would actually increase informality and unemployment, because essentially these migrants would arrive in urban labor markets, would be facing a very rigid formal sector, and they would be queuing for these formal jobs either in informality or in unemployment. Okay. So then again, a challenge to this. And actually, some recent evidence with credible identification strategies have, in the short run at least, confirmed this view or these predictions that higher internal migration, especially from rural to urban settings, would lead to higher unemployment and higher informality. Now, perhaps as a counter to this Harris-Dodaro view, I would like to, and of course, this is especially if you take literally the papers that they wrote, almost 50 years ago. I don't want to here criticize these frameworks per se, but like actually the framework that influences so much how we think about this phenomena rely on very strong assumptions, and oftentimes they don't correspond to the facts and the regularities that we observe in these urban labor markets. The first one is actually something that Penny discussed in some of the facts. It seems that labor markets are not dual in many developing countries, in particular not in Latin America, in urban areas. So you see a great overlap of formal and informal firms in terms of productivity and firm size distributions. You see informal workers in formal firms, so that's the intensive margin of informality. You also see formal and informal firms operating within very narrowly defined industries. So it's not like they are producing and operating in completely separate economic spaces. And another thing that is quite important to what I'll show you today is that the Harris-Dodaro is a very static view of the world, and in particular, it completely ignores firm dynamics. And that will be playing a super important role in what I'll show you today. So, and finally, something quite obvious perhaps, but like it's worth mentioning nevertheless, is that these inflows represent not only a labor supply shock, a positive labor supply shock to these urban markets, but also represent a demand shock to firms operating in these markets. And once you move away from this dual view, it can actually be the case that you can see these inflows generating more dynamism in the formal sector, even if these workers are initially absorbed in the informal sector or informal jobs. Okay? So the big question here is what are the labor market and aggregate effects of rural to urban migration in local urban economies in Brazil? So what we do, we proceed in 3 steps. First of all, we do a traditional, in a sense, traditional in the state-of-the-art shift-share IV design to understand what are the effects, and then in a very reduced form sense, in a diff-in-diff setting, therefore uncovering relative effects of places that receive more internal migrants as opposed to places that receive less. And we use a shift-share IV design to uncover these causal effects, first of all, on local labor markets. And that was a big surprise to us. And I should, again, because we came to this project probably highly influenced by the Harris-Dodaro's view. So what we find is that actually places that receive more immigrants, or more internal migrants, experience an increase in formal jobs, an increase in the share of formal jobs at the expense or reduction of informal jobs with no effect on unemployment. And that comes together with a reduction in both formal and informal wages. Now, we were quite puzzled by this at first, And then we went on and examined the effects on firm dynamics in the formal sector, because that's what we have data for. So we heavily rely on the data that Penny just described, the HEIS data set. And what we find there is that first of all, confirming what we see in the demographic census, we see an increase in the number of formal jobs and in the number of formal firms, and that's all induced by firm entry in the formal sector. Okay, and then also at the firm level, we also see this reduction in formal wages that we see in the census. Now, pause here. If you know the literature in the US, a major reason for concern is the slowdown in the entry rate of firms in that country, the startup deficit, as they call it, because a lot of the dynamism in the labor market is produced by these new entrants and churning the formal sector is the sector. There's no distinction between formal and informal. So here, these are, in a sense, the mirror effects or the mirror mechanism that you would expect, or the opposite that you see there. Here, there's a slowdown in labor supply due to demographic factors that has been playing a major role in explaining why there's a slowdown in entry rates in different sectors, and therefore lower dynamism in the formal sector, in the economy. Now here, what we see is the opposite. We see places that receive a higher labor supply shock because of internal migration see greater entry in the formal sector in the longer run, and greater entry and greater churning, but the entry effects dominates. Now, to further understand what's going on, then we developed a firm dynamics model. And when I get there, I won't have time to discuss the model. I'll just give you the main elements of the model, and I'll highlight also some differences compared to what Penny just described in our joint work. But we use this model and the wealth of data that we have in Brazil to estimate the model, and then run counterfactuals of different labor supply shocks to understand even more the mechanism of the effects that could be behind what we document in the reduced form analysis. And there, reassuringly, the model confirms all the findings that I just described in terms of increases in the share of formal jobs and a decrease in informality, increase in entry in the formal sector, so on and so forth. So these are the I hope to cover today in the next perhaps 25 minutes. Great. I'll talk a lot about the empirical results because perhaps this is the most striking, or at least to me again, surprising part. And then I won't have time at all to, of course, cover structural model estimation, but I will show you, if I can, a couple of counterfactual exercises to shed further light on the results that we have in the reduced form. So in terms of data sources, what we do, we heavily rely on the demographic census to not only measure local labor market outcomes at the municipality level over 3 decades, but in particular, our focus will be 2000 to 2010, so because these are the latest waves available. But also the census allows you to measure migration patterns across all municipalities in Brazil, and that's important for 2 reasons. That gives us our endogenous regressor of interest, which is the immigration rate accumulated over this 10-year period. But also it allows us to compute the shift share instrument, because we can go to the previous decade and map the flows of migration between all municipalities. That gives us the share of all origins to all potential destinations in terms of migration flows, pre-existing migration flows. Okay? And then what we do in terms of firm data, we use the HEIS data set to look at firm dynamics at the municipality level again over the same time period, with the advantage that with HEIS we can have an annual panel, so we can look at dynamic effects post-2010 all the way to late 2010s. And then we can talk about firm dynamics. It would also be important to estimate the model later on. And then the second data set that we use is the one that Penny already mentioned, the CINFI survey that we use to estimate the model, because we don't have that data. It's a survey and it's representative. It's not representative all the way to the municipality level, so we cannot use it in the empirical exercise. And in terms of push shocks, these are the shocks that will act as the shift in the shift share instrument that we construct. These are forces that could be pushing people away from different origins to different destinations. And for that, we will use our main, or our focus in terms of the main analysis will be price shocks to the crops grown in each one of these municipalities that could be sending people to different urban destinations. Okay, so what we do, we use the agricultural census to compute the shares of the different crops in different municipalities to predict how affected each one of these municipalities will be by the changes in international prices of these crops. But then also importantly, we use a second push shock as in our robustness exercise, which are the drought shocks that occur in Brazil. And this is important because, and perhaps I can show you this. Okay. The joys of being a Mac user. You can embarrass yourself when you have a PC. Well, it should be working, right? Estou tentando clicar aqui, não consigo. Bom, well, never mind. Believe me when I say, since I've just embarrassed myself already, I might just carry on and avoid further embarrassment. But essentially, the advantage of these two shocks is that they affect different regions in the country. So that, and we find exactly the same results regardless of which push shock we use. So I think that adds credibility to the exercise because it's not about a specific set of compliers in a specific pairs of regions of sending and receiving origin. So that reinforces, I think, our exercises. Okay. So in terms of the empirical design, if you've seen any shift hair IV design before, this will be no surprise to you. So essentially, we estimate already everything in first differences. For our main specification, our delta are decadal changes in labor market outcomes at a municipality D for destination at the municipality level. And this is important as well because these are not short-run changes. These are long-run changes in response to this migration shocks. And our endogenous regressor of interest is the accumulated immigration rate from all potential origins to that particular municipality D over the 10-year period. And that's also, in a sense, a lot driven by the way that the census asks the question of where people come from. Importantly, we cannot document, we miss two very important things. One is a return migration, because the way that questions are asked, we cannot really document that and correct for that. And the other is step migration, okay, just to be completely clear. In the baseline, we control for baseline characteristics, basic ones, such as share of male, young, and high-skilled workers. We do a lot in the robustness exercise that I'll show you in a few slides. And then we have our instrument for this endogenous regressor, which is the shift share instrument that I mentioned, where the shares are exactly in the decade before, in the 90s, the fraction of migrants coming to a particular municipality D from every single potential sending municipality O. So these are the shares, and the shifts will be, in our main specification, the price shocks, in our robustness analysis, the drought shocks. And then, as I said, the highs allows us to study dynamics, and therefore we can look at pre-trends. Reassuringly, we find none, but also at dynamic effects post-2010. So in terms of the effects on workers, this is kind of the first headline result. We do what we find is a 1 percentage point increase in immigration rate. You can focus on the IV panel. A 1 percentage point increase in the immigration rate in a given municipality leads to a 0.4 percentage points increase in the share of formal jobs as a fraction of the working age population. You might not find this a mind-blowing result, but it actually is a sizable effect if you take the average employment share of 19% of formal employment in the average municipality. That's a 2.1% increase. What's really, we thought, surprising is that this effect is completely driven by the formalization of the labor force and no effect whatsoever on unemployment rates. And if you look at the columns 4 and 5, what you see is a decline in wages both in the formal and informal sectors. Now, I don't have time to go through all these links, but the first thing we show there is that actually, in terms of the composition of the labor force, the impacts of these inflows are neutral in terms of skill composition. So they are not substantially increasing the presence of low-skilled workers, for example. They are quite, essentially, they have zero effect on skill composition. But they do increase the presence of young males, which is kind of the typical also migrant population in these settings. And the employment effects are also not concentrated in low-skilled workers, and perhaps that's intuitive once I told you that these are skill neutral. So these effects are observed both within the low-skill and the high-skill workers. Okay? And then we move to the firms, the firm effects. And here was the magnitudes actually become quite substantial. So first of all, like this first column shows the effect of immigration on the number of formal firms. And you see here that a 1 percentage point increase in the immigration rate leads to a 2.4% increase in the number of formal firms, a 2.2 increase in the number of formal jobs. And this is entire, and you can see, as I mentioned already, like the negative effect on wages. And again, this is entirely driven by entry. So you can see here a 7.4% increase in the number of entrants. And of course, there is an increase in exit rates. You're inducing a bunch of people to enter the formal sector. It's only natural to expect that a lot of that would increase exit as well. But the net effect is an increase in the number of formal firms. So the first thing that people typically think when they see this is, are these migrants actually creating these firms? Are they the entrepreneurs that are fostering this firm creation? We only have an imperfect way to look at that using the census. We find no evidence that the migrants are the ones creating these firms. We don't see a greater, for example, prevalence of entrepreneurs amongst the migrants in places that receive higher inflows. In terms of composition, this is not the beautiful structural transformation story that you would expect, perhaps, in the sense that there is a decrease in the fraction of jobs in manufacturing and an increase in services and construction, which is intuitive for at least two reasons. First of all, construction is the typical sector that absorbs migrants in Brazil, and I think in many places. But on top of that, the service sector is likely the sector that benefits from the demand shock, because here we conflate both things. We conflate the labor supply shock and also the demand shock. So the non-tradable sector is the one that is more likely to benefit from these demand shocks. So it's consistent with that. And also when you decompose the shifts in the fraction of formal jobs and formal firms across the distribution of, let me call it firm quality, because here we're not using the gray data in IBGE's secure data room. So we cannot estimate productivity per se, so we get at proxies of that. When we do that, the employment and especially firm composition is shifting heavily away from the top quartile of firm quality and into the lower middle and bottom quartiles, which is consistent with this, what I just told you about sectoral composition. And also, when you look at firm size, it's consistent with the jobs and firms in particular shifting towards smaller firms. So, and in terms of dynamic effects, essentially we don't see these effects fading out at all over time. Again, this is the hyperlink, and I have 5 minutes. So what I can tell is that these effects do not fade out. They, if anything, they increase slightly over time. Now, I have 5 minutes. Okay, no, first of all, let me talk about this great paper that I have with Vladimir. No, but just kidding. I'm not talking about the paper, but I'll borrow from that paper the measure of enforcement capacity that Penny alluded to in her presentation, to look at heterogeneous effects that are, in terms of regions that have higher enforcement and lower enforcement, to see, because what that allows us to do is to speak to the question of, is informality and the presence of high informality in particular allowing these economies to reap greater dividends from these labor supply shocks, or is the other way around? And in particular, if you think about informality as going together with other frictions, are these frictions dampening the ability of these urban economies to reap the dividends from this urban population growth, or is the other way around? So here what we do is that I don't have time at all to go into the details, so I believe on the work we've done before. And we look at this heterogeneity in terms of the ability to enforce labor regulations on formal firms. So it's not like inspections on informal firms. It's inspections of the labor ministry, essentially. And what you can see here is that all the effects in terms of firm entry, increases in the number of formal firms and formal jobs, is concentrated in higher enforcement areas. And that's not controlling, it doesn't matter what you throw at this regression. You can throw distance to the nearest state capital. You can throw, of course, GDP per capita, all of these things that could be, in principle, could lead you to think that this is just proxying for different levels of development. Actually, this is not the case. This result remains. So it seems that informality is actually hurting more than helping in that, which is very much in line, actually, with the results that Penny was just discussing on our other work. So, and then let me, as usual, I have no time to talk about the structural model. I'll just tell you that the structural model basically confirms all the reduced form results that we have, but allows us also to talk about mechanisms. And one of the things that comes out of the model is actually the high formalization that we see as a result of these labor supply shocks is not coming from newly created formal firms, but rather from the formalization of informal firms that go into the formal sector now that wages are declining. Okay. Now, this might seem counterintuitive, given that I just told you that actually higher enforcement or places with higher enforcement allow the economists to reap greater benefits. But actually, this in equilibrium, you can see that very clearly that economies that have higher enforcement are in a different equilibrium altogether. So it's not like this analysis makes a lot more sense when you think about in GE terms rather than just like this partial derivatives. And I'm just going to conclude just to reinforce the credibility of these reduced forms results that I just showed you. This is this robustness slide. I often joke this is one slide worth 1 year of work. And so we do a lot, okay? We do, because we weren't sure. I mean, to be quite honest, we were quite surprised at what we found. So we threw everything that we could at the results to see if it would stand. The good news is it does. So we look at pre-trends, and it holds. Potential confounders in many different potential confounders. One key thing in this type of IV strategy is the potential problem with the shares is that they could be capturing just persistent effects of migration if those are quite persistent over time. So we control for past migration to reassure us that this is not what's happening, and indeed is not. We control for potential demand channels. In that sense, another thing that these shocks could be doing is a shift in demand also at destination locations, especially if these are urban areas attached to a rural or agricultural hub. We control for local prices at destination. The effects remain. Another key thing is that you might have seen a recent paper by Paula Bustos, Jacopo Ponticelli, and Albert Christoph that looks at labor and capital reallocation as a consequence of drought shocks in Brazil. So what we do, we reconstruct their networks of banks and use those as our shares and use our shift shocks to see if essentially what we are capturing is capital movements rather than people moving across space. We control for that. Results remain unchanged. And as I said, we use the drought shocks as an alternative shock, and the results essentially remain unchanged. So that, and again, because these are coming from different origins and destinations, it's reassuring that we are capturing a more general phenomenon than specific to specific locations. So as I said, no time for that. So perhaps, can I have 1 minute? Okay. So that's a good thing about being in Brazil. You can always kind of like, no, please. If you don't mind, 1 minute. But, and the fact that I know Chris for a long time. So you can see here, like what we do is the baseline Brazilian economy, so as estimated for the average Brazilian economy in 2003. And then what we do is actually recalibrate the model to a high enforcement area. And we can do this both in terms of, and I didn't talk about the model at all, but we have two margins of informality. The extensive margin, which is whether firms register or not the business, and the intensive margin, which is whether formal firms hire informal workers, which is arguably important in this question. And what you see here is that both in the baseline economy and even more so in a high enforcement economy, labor supply shocks, as we simulate them in the model, do lead to an increase in the share of formal workers and in the share of formal firms, okay? As in the reduced form analysis, these results are reinforced in the high enforcement location as in the reduced form. But what's key for us is that we are able to look at GE effects, and in particular, for example, we can look at total output and total output per capita. So unsurprisingly, because you're not creating jobs in the most productive and dynamic, say, parts of the economy, you do see this increases in formal jobs and formal firms, but this comes at the expense of a reduction in output per worker because you're not formalizing and increasing jobs in the most productive parts of the economy. Let me conclude here so I don't push Christine's goodwill too far. But that's it. I'm happy to also take questions here or over coffee. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gabriel, for a nice talk. Now you have Brenda. I hope that you can have 5 minutes at the end for questions, so let's see.
Thank you so much for the invite. It is my pleasure to show you this relatively new work. So like Gabriel, I'm going to focus on this one paper where I want us to shift focus away from what both Penny and Gabriel did, away from firms and towards workers. Right, so I think both of the prior presenters did a good job of setting me up for my work, so thank you to the organizers for ordering us in this way. So Penny mentioned that there's at least a couple of reasons why policymakers might want to push formalization policies. She said maybe they want to increase taxes. Maybe they want to increase efficiency, right? And then Gabriel gave us another reason. He said maybe we want good jobs in the economy. So what I want to do in this paper is I want to ask, is a formal job really a good job? What does it mean to have a good job? And in order to answer that question, we're going to try to estimate the value of a formal job and compare it to how much it costs. Like, would the worker prefer, the answer to this question depends on a lot of things. It depends on preferences. We've talked about how informality offers more flexibility. The gig economy has brought us that. But maybe a worker doesn't want a flexible job. Maybe they prefer job stability, right? In which case, then, is a formal job a good one or not? Likewise, the value of formality depends on the outside option. Maybe I would rather have my employer give me the taxes, I'll take them in my pocket, and then I'll go and I buy pension in the private market, right? I go and pay for daycare centers that the government can provide out of my own pocket, or I decide not to work and take care of my own children, right? So this is what we're trying to get at. We want to know if a formal job is a good job, and in particular, we want to compare that to how much it costs both the employer and the worker to get access to the various broad defined benefits of formality. So that's the goal. This is joint work with Bhavya Sharma, who is a fantastic PhD student at UC Santa Cruz, so be on the lookout for her if you're on the job market. All right, so first off, a brief introduction into how Social Security works in Mexico. Okay, so in Mexico, like in other countries in Latin America and around the world, employers are obligated to register their salaried employees after hiring them. Right, so once you register a worker, this entitles the worker to a broad set of benefits. Upon retirement, they'll get a pension. While they're employed, they get access to healthcare benefits for themselves and their family members. Up until recently, if you're female, you also get free daycare centers from the government. So it's a very broad network. You also get subsidized goods. And all of this is financed through payroll taxes that include contributions by both employer and worker. However, again, like in other places in Latin America, enforcement is limited, and payroll taxes are particularly high, are especially high for low-income workers. So if you're a worker that earns the minimum wage, your contribution to Social Security amount to 35% of the worker's wage. So it's a pretty high number. And given that enforcement is low, we find that over half of the employed population is not registered with the Social Security Institute, and hence doesn't pay payroll taxes, doesn't get the benefits either. And then I want to highlight, we've talked a lot about how informality is a complex issue. There's self-employment, there's formal firms, there's informal firms. For this talk, I want to focus on one very specific type of informality, which is informality within formal firms. So these are already firms that are paying taxes on their profits and somehow decide, some of my workers I'm going to register, I'm going to pay taxes for, and hence they're going to get the benefits, and other workers won't. So in the case of Mexico, one of the findings from my research is that 1 out of every 4 salaried workers in a formal firm is informally employed. Okay, so that's the context that I want you to have in mind. So these are workers that are at firms that could potentially give them those benefits, and they don't. Right, so again, the question is, what is the value of formality? How much would a household be willing to pay in order to get access to a formal job offer, and how does that compare to the taxes that need to be paid in order to actually receive said offer? Right, and to answer this question, we're going to follow the next steps. So first of all, we attempt this, we believe, novel exercise. It's kind of like this thought experiment. We say, imagine what would be the income that a household would have to receive in order to respond to that new income in the same way that they do when they receive the benefits of a formal job. And that compensating income is going to be our initial measure of the value of formality. So that's the first thing that I'm going to show you. The second thing that we do, I'm going to also be naive like Gabriel and claim that I'm going to show you the structural model. Unlikely to happen. But in the paper, the second thing that we do is we write down a model of joint labor supply. And this is one of the contributions that I also want to highlight. We're going to think about formality and its value as a shared thing. Like households don't take decisions on a vacuum. The decisions are not isolated, right? The spouses move together, they switch jobs, they make decisions of which jobs to take and reject based on what they received already, potentially from their spouse's employment status. So we're going to take that into account, which is not as novel in the developed countries' literature, but in the informality literature, it's actually kind of rare to take into account spouses and children and potentially elder people in the family. So we're going to have joint labor supply. We're going to have surge frictions and voluntary and involuntary separations. And we're going to explicitly incorporate the value of a formal job in said model, which we then are going to estimate using joint decision-making moments from the data. And finally, what we're going to do is we're going to test the model by comparing the value that we got from our first step, which is a reduced form that we estimate completely independently from the model. And then we're going to compare both of our estimates, and we're going to find that there's actually a very good overlap between the two, and we think that this is a reassuring finding. So that's the or roadmap. So next, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about institutional details, just to make sure that you're more familiar with the Mexican scenario. Then I'll present the data that we're going to use. I'll tell you about our reduced form compensating income thought experiment. And again, being naive, I'll show you the highlights of the model, and then I'll conclude. Okay. So first of all, like I said, when you hire a worker within 5 business days of starting this employment relationship, the employer needs to tell the Social Security Institute, also known as IMSS, I have this new worker, and every time that the employee gets a paycheck, part of the paycheck needs to go to the Social Security Institute. Okay, so that's what the law says. In practice, again, that doesn't always happen. The law also says upon registration, then the worker is going to get this broad set of benefits. They get healthcare, paid maternity leave, free daycare centers, subsidized mortgage credits, retirement fund, disability fund, separation, severance payment, discounts on subsidized goods. So this seems like a great package that would lead us to believe formal jobs are good jobs. Now, this is in paper. In practice, because of various reasons, a lot of workers, even the ones that are registered, don't end up using a lot of these benefits, right? If I retire before meeting the threshold for a pension, then I'm contributing to the system potentially for many years, and then never get the benefits of a formal sector full pension, right? Like, similarly, if I don't have children, I'm paying for these daycares, never get them. Also, even if I do have children, the daycares tend to be saturated. So there's many reasons why the worker might be, actually, don't register me, give me the money, I'll stick it in my pocket, and then I'll do whatever I choose to with this cash transfer instead, right? So like I said, the costs are also high, and then potentially, not just because there's this redistribution across workers, depending on how long they actually stay in the formal sector or not, the setup of taxes themselves make it such that it is more expensive as a share of the wage to hire a low-income worker formally than it is to hire a high-income worker. So this is due to 2 characteristics of the tax system. The first one is that there's a lower bound to how much the employer needs to contribute for any worker. And that lower bound is tied to the minimum wage. So it's 20.4% of the minimum wage. And then on top of that, there's a proportional component. And then there's an upper bound to total contribution. So at most, an employer is going to contribute 16% of 25 minimum wages. So this combination of a fixed fee plus an upper bound of contributions makes it such that it's expensive to hire low-income workers as formal. All right? So what we're going to do next is we're going to grab some data to try to get at how much value is there. Like I said, there's this potential mismatch between what the paper says a worker should get, what looks like a very good job, and then these high costs. So The data that we're going to use to get this estimate is, first of all, a survey, a household survey called as ENOE. So ENOE is, like I said, household survey, nationally representative. We're going to use the data from 2005 and 2016. If you're familiar with the US data, this is the equivalent of the current population survey. So households are followed for 5 quarters. It's a rotating panel. There's approximately 120,000 households and 420,000 individuals on each quarter. And the benefit of this is that we have very detailed both individual and household level characteristics that allow us to see the formality, status of the employee, the firm that they're working at, whether that firm is formal or not. We actually know the name of the firm as well. We know their wages, and so on. Right? So we have a lot of information, and we can track both the worker, we can track their transitions across formality, not just across jobs, but even within the same firm, which is going to be very important for us. And then we're going to combine that with a directory of firms by the Ministry of Labor in Mexico, known as the DNE, and their inspection logs. So I won't go into a lot of details about this, but essentially what happens is the Ministry of Labor has a list of formal firms. And from this list, they choose a random set to inspect each year. Right? So these firms are going to get hit by inspections, and we have that information. We know which firms got inspected at which point in time. Okay? So that's our data. And here's a few descriptive statistics from said data. On the upper panel of the table, you see the joint distribution of employment status between spouses. So here we're focusing only on households that have a head of household who is either married or has a stable partner. And we're also focusing only on heterosexual couples. So what we see is that the most likely outcome in Mexico, if you choose someone at random, is that the head of household is formally employed and their spouse is not working. Okay? So given if the head of household is formal, then it is highly likely that their spouse is also formal. So there's some evidence of assortative matching in the sample. And then in the lower panel, we just have average wages. So this is pesos per hour. So as one might expect, again, if there's assortative matching, when the head of household has a formal job and their partner does too, then the average wage is higher than when their spouse is informally employed. Again, there seems to be some evidence of partnering up. So what I want to highlight about this, besides just giving you some descriptive statistics that you might not be familiar with, is that formality is highly endogenous, right? Not just yours, but also your partner's, right? The probability that you're formal depends on your spouse's characteristics, your own. So this makes it a challenge to understand really what happens when a household gets a formal job, right? So which is what we want to know. We want to know how do households respond to receiving a formal job, and what can we infer about the value of formality from said response. So what we're going to do is, rather than just look at how houses respond when they get a formal job, we're going to use these random inspections as a shock to the probability of receiving a formal job offer. Now, in shameless self-promotion and cross-citation, I'm going to redirect you to this paper by myself and Leon Fernandez Bujanda, where we show that, in fact, these inspections are random and that they increase almost double the probability that a worker who is informally employed at a formal firm receives a formal job offer from their same employer without changing the hours worked, their wages. So this is a worker that is exactly in the same job with the same firm, and then now just has the little stamp that allows them to receive the benefits of formality. Okay? So what we do is we take the sample of households with at least one spouse employed at an establishment that is eligible for one of these inspections at some point in time during the time that we observe them in the survey. And then we're going to match those households that did receive an inspection with others that look exactly like them, but were not selected for this random inspection. Right? We match on their location at the state level. We match on their income decile. We match on whether they have children or not in daycare age. We match whether there's like an elder present in the household. So thankfully, we can observe all of these characteristics and match upon them. And then we're just going to assign placebo inspections and do a standard diff and diff stack diff-in-diff design, right? Which looks, so our baseline specification looks like this. Our dependent variable is conditional on having some joint labor market status at the beginning. We're going to separately estimate this for each possible joint labor market status. And we're going to say conditional on that, what is the probability that the spouse who did not receive an inspection, so this is spouse, not I, transitions to a formal job, an informal job, or unemployment, given that their partner was treated by an inspection. And we have two-way fixed effects and then also person fixed effects. Okay? So this is our what we find. We do this also separately by household wage quintiles. Okay? So here I'm only going to show you the responses when the spouse who was not inspected was initially not employed. So this is, a partner, the wife is not employed, their husband is employed informally and then receives an inspection. So we see what does the wife do afterwards. And what we find is an important drop in the probability of a formal job, right? Which will be consistent with a positive income shock, right? The household receives all of a sudden these benefits, daycare, a future pension, a more stable job, healthcare. And what they do is they are less likely, if you take every household together, there's a 7 percentage point decrease in the probability of being formally employed. And again, there's important heterogeneity across wage quintiles, right? The people in the middle of the income distribution have larger responses than the people to the tails, okay? There's also some effects on informal jobs, but not very large. They're not statistically significant for the bottom of the wage distribution, and they're negative, although only marginally at that very liberal interpretations of statistical significance. So most of the effect is there's a lower probability of taking a formal job, which makes sense because a lot of the benefits of formality are shared with the household. So if I'm already getting the healthcare services and pensions from my spouse employer, why would I go and pay the taxes again, right? Not all the benefits are shared, true, but it seems like the power of the benefits that are shared dominates. So that's what we find. And then what we ask is this theoretical exercise. So it's a hypothetical exercise where imagine you have two households, right? And one of them, a helicopter drop, as economists that we like, goes by, and in one of the households, they drop a formal job offer, which is what the inspections, we argue, are doing. And then the other household, you start dropping money to the households, right? So whenever there's a shock, households re-optimize. They're going to change how much time they spend working, how much time they spend in leisure. They're going to reallocate their consumption. So we're going to observe those changes, and we're going to say, well, how much money does the helicopter need to drop in this house in order for the labor supply change that we observe in this household and the one that we observe in this one is equalized? And again, that's going to be our measure of the value of a formal job. And this is what we find. Now, in order to do this, we require some assumptions. We require, among other things, a measure of income elasticity, which there isn't a very supported one for Mexico. Especially, we require an elasticity of income to labor force participation in the formal sector. So we borrow this range of measures from a paper by the IFS that simulated taxes in Mexico and argued that these are reasonable ranges to assume for income elasticities across different wage quintiles in Mexico. And this is what we find. So this is the compensating income. So this means that taking the upper bound of income elasticity for the top 40% of the wage distribution, or findings for the formality elasticity of labor supply, imply that this household is reacting as if they had received a 24% increase in income. Okay? If you take the lower bound of the income elasticity, then this is almost equivalent to a doubling of their income. So the bounds are large, but at any of these bounds, given what an employer has to pay to formalize a worker in this top end of the distribution, the value cost ratio of formalizing this worker is definitely positive. Okay, it can be up to 26% of the fiscal cost, right? But there's a lot of heterogeneity across the distribution. Even though the people in the middle are the ones that respond the most to receiving a formal job, because of heterogeneity in these measures of income elasticity, and more importantly, because of the regressive nature of the taxation system in Mexico, the net value of a formal job ends up being negative for the bottom part of the income distribution. So that the main takeaways here of this table is that, first of all, there's substantial heterogeneity, right? And consequent in how they respond to getting a formal job, and hence in this implied income shock that they're receiving. And then even if we assume that income elasticities were homogeneous across every income decile, the value of a formal job for the median household would still be positive. Although, again, it will start getting close to negative because of the high taxes. Okay, so that's, I have, I think, like 4 minutes left, so I will show you some highlights of the model. So the main point of the model is, like I said, we have this joint labor supply. We have two spouses. At any point in time, they can either be formally employed, informally employed, or out of the labor force. This is a partial equilibrium model, so just randomly people are receiving job offers. And then also exogenously, there's going to be some separation rates, right? So this is pretty standard search and matching model. Each spouse, we're going to assume draws from a different wage distribution. And crucially, we make a big assumption about what utility looks like. So every person in the household is trying to maximize the joint utility because consumption is fully public. Like wages and any benefit that you get from formality, you're going to share with your spouse fully. Okay, so this is an important assumption. And the key parameter that we're going to try to estimate is this psi parameter here, which is that utility that you get if either one of the two members of the household is formally employed. Okay, we're going to assume risk aversion as well, and I too cannot show the next thing, so that's fine. So I can just do this instead. Here we go. This is what I want to show you. Okay. So a baseline value function looks something like this. Suppose that you have a head of household that is informally employed and their partner is not employed, right? So the value function is always going to be a function of the status, of the joint labor market status. So this person is informally employed with this wage. So the household is receiving this wage, which is discounted with risk aversion parameter delta. And again, this delta is going to matter for how much people value things that are going to come in the future, right? And volatility of income as well. This household, this is an indicator that's going to be equal to 0 because they're informally employed and hence they're not actually getting the benefits right now. With some probability, this spouse is going to separate and now both are going to be unemployed. With some probability, there's going to be some job arrival offer that's going to transition them. They can decide whether to accept it or not. Some probability, the second spouse, which is currently unemployed, is going to receive a job offer. So what I want to highlight here is that this is all, the solution to this is characterized by a set of reservation wages, which are, of course, determined by the joint status. So already here, we don't need the inspections to estimate this model. We have all of the joint transitions. We don't need it, but we can add it. We can add it. So with some probability, eta, an inspection is going to arrive. And that inspection, on the one hand, increases the probability that that worker gets formalized at the same firm with the same wage, but it also increases the probability that that worker separates. So we can estimate this as an additional robustness check to our model. So right now what we chose to do is rather than take this part of the model, we chose to estimate this version of it. So that means that we're not targeting the responses of the household that I show you. We're not using them at all or incorporating in the model. And nonetheless, this is what we get from our estimates in the model. This is my last slide, so don't worry. So we're going to estimate this model without using the numbers about inspections. We have 22 parameters and 84 moments to estimate it. And we're going to measure marginal willingness to pay in this way. So we take our parameter psi, which is just the utility, divided by the marginal utility of income at the median wage. So this is the median wage. And what we get is that the median household is willing to pay essentially 1,000 pesos per month to have a formal job. Now, this represents about 19% of the median income wage. And the average payroll tax for someone in that wage bracket is 20%. So this gives us a value cost ratio of 0.97, which is within the range that we were getting from the reduced form estimates. So we find it reassuring that even though we came at this question from two very different roads and got consistent results. So that's what we have so far. So we combine this structural model, plausibly exogenous variation in the arrival rate of job offers, and some novel thought experiment and some cool data to answer the question, is a formal job a good job? And the takeaways from this, I think, are, first of all, that there's heterogeneity. There's important heterogeneity, and outside options matter. However, the before taxes value is definitely positive and large. And the reason why the value of a formal job comes out as negative for the bottom part of the distribution is not because they have a lower value for it. Quite the opposite. They actually have larger values, but rather because of the regressive nature of the tax system. So that's an important lesson for policymakers, we would argue. So, thank you.